The hot Nevada desert stretched endlessly before Mike Thompson as he gripped the wheel of his big rig, steering it along the narrow highway that cut through the barren landscape. The air outside was still, heavy with the oppressive heat of the late summer night. Mike had made this journey hundreds of times before, the rhythmic hum of the engine his only company as the truck thundered across the deserted stretch of road. His headlights pierced the blackness, illuminating the cracked asphalt and occasional cacti that dotted the roadside. The wind was barely a whisper tonight, but the air felt thick, as though the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Mike wasn't superstitious. He was a trucker after all, and you didn't last long on the road if you let fear take the wheel. But tonight, something was different. There was a strange heaviness in the air, as though the desert had a dark secret it was keeping from him. A shiver ran down his spine as he glanced out the side window, his gaze scanning the vast empty wasteland. His mind began to wander, thinking of the small diner he had passed earlier, where the tired faces of truck drivers greeted him in silence. The grizzled owner had warned him of strange happenings on this stretch of highway, especially at night. It was a place known to many truckers as the Devil's Route, a road where stories of ghostly apparitions, sudden disappearances, and cursed spirits circulated among those who dared to drive it after dark. Nothing but tales. Mike had dismissed them, a skeptic to the core. But as the road stretched ahead and the wind picked up, his unease began to grow. The headlights illuminated something off the side of the road, something moving. Mike squinted, unsure of what he was seeing. A figure, a woman. Her silhouette was barely discernible against the desert backdrop, but there was no mistaking her presence. Mike's heart skipped a beat. What was she doing out here? The truck's tires crunched against the gravel as he slowed the rig, rolling down the window cautiously. As the truck came to a stop, the woman remained still, standing motionless in the middle of the road, her long, tattered white dress flowing in the breeze. "Hey, you okay?" Mike called out, his voice carrying across the empty desert. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she slowly turned her head to face him, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that sent a cold shiver through his body. Mike's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes, those eyes were deep fiery red like two burning coals. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her features drawn with a haunting emptiness that seemed to suck the warmth out of the air around him. "What are you doing out here?" Mike muttered under his breath, wondering what sort of person would be wandering alone in the desert at this time of night. The woman didn't respond. She only stood there staring at him with those unnatural eyes. Mike's heart began to race. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He fumbled with the gears, trying to drive the truck away, but his hand faltered. The engine sputtered. He tried again, but the truck was stuck, the wheels spinning helplessly on the gravel. Panic began to seep into his mind. The woman hadn't moved. She was just standing there, her eyes locked on him, almost as if she were waiting for something. Then, with a sudden surge of adrenaline, Mike slammed the gear shift into reverse, but his hand froze. He felt something, some invisible force, holding him in place. His body refused to move, as if he was paralyzed. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, and his breath came in shallow gasps. The woman began to move towards him. Slow, deliberate steps, her feet barely touching the ground. Mike's heart was hammering in his chest. He slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, but the truck didn't budge. It felt as if the desert itself was holding him captive. Her face was now only a few feet away. She reached the truck and placed her cold ice-like fingers against the window. Mike felt the chill seep through the glass, as though she were touching his very soul. Her smile twisted into something sinister, her lips curling upward in a grotesque mockery of amusement. "You thought you could leave?" she whispered, her voice like a cold wind brushing against his skin. Mike froze. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What was happening? What was she? The woman's face pressed closer, her eyes now glowing brighter, blood red like a pair of flames staring directly into his soul. And then, just as suddenly as it began, she vanished. The world seemed to stop. There was no sound, no movement. The desert was still deathly quiet. Mike opened his eyes, his heart still pounding in his chest. The truck was moving again, the engine roaring to life as if nothing had happened. He slammed his foot on the brake, nearly swerving off the road in panic. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around. The woman was gone. There was nothing, just the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert. Shaking, Mike drove the truck to the nearest town, a small, rundown desert oasis known for its truck stop diner. The lights flickered weakly in the distance as he pulled up to the diner. He parked the rig and stumbled inside, his hands still trembling. A few truckers were sitting around the counter, nursing cups of coffee and talking in hushed tones. The diner owner, an old man with a salt and pepper beard, gave Mike a knowing look as he sat down. "Long night?" the old man asked, his eyes narrowing in concern. Mike's throat felt dry as he tried to find the words. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was a woman on the road. I saw her. Her eyes, they were red. I couldn't move. It felt like something was holding me there. I don't know how to explain it." The old man leaned in, his face serious. "You're not the first to tell that story," he said quietly. "That stretch of road, people say it's cursed. A woman died out there years ago. They say her spirit haunts the highway, looking for a victim every year." Mike stared at him in disbelief. "You're saying she's dead?" The old man nodded gravely. "Yeah, and every year she claims someone. You were lucky to get out." Mike didn't know what to make of the man's words. He felt the weight of dread settle deep in his stomach. He had never believed in ghosts, but what he had experienced tonight had shaken him to his core. The next few days were a blur. Mike couldn't shake the image of the woman's red eyes from his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, her twisted smile, her cold, lifeless eyes staring through him. The nightmares started almost immediately. Every time he slept, he found himself back on that deserted road, the truck stuck, the woman's face pressing against the window, her cold fingers reaching for him. He couldn't take it anymore. His once peaceful life on the road had been shattered by the horror he had witnessed. He knew he had to return to that road to understand what had happened and perhaps to find some kind of closure. Mike contacted his old friend Dave, who had been a fellow trucker for years. Dave listened to his story with skepticism, but after hearing the fear in Mike's voice, he agreed to go with him to confront whatever was haunting that stretch of highway. They drove together, the night air thick with the same oppressive weight that had hung over Mike's first encounter. The road was just as desolate, the silence just as unnerving. As they reached the spot where Mike had first seen the woman, they stopped the truck. "This is it," Mike said, his voice barely audible. Dave looked around, his eyes scanning the dark desert, but he didn't see anything. "I don't see anything," he said, trying to reassure Mike. "Maybe it was just your mind playing tricks on you." But Mike knew better. He had felt it, the weight of something watching them, the same oppressive presence. Just as Mike was about to speak, the wind picked up. It was cold, unnaturally cold for a desert night. The air grew thick, heavy. Mike could feel the temperature drop, his breath coming out in frosty clouds. And then, they saw her. She appeared from the shadows just as Mike had seen her before. Her long white dress fluttered around her like a ghostly shroud, her blood-red eyes glowing in the darkness. She was floating toward them, her feet barely touching the ground. Dave's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Do you see her?" Mike whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman's face twisted into that same sinister smile as she drew closer. "You thought you could escape," she whispered, her voice like ice. Mike reached for the talisman that Miriam had given him, clutching it tightly in his hand. He began chanting the words she had taught him. But this time, it felt different. The air was thick, charged with an energy that seemed to resist him, pulling at his very soul. The woman stopped in front of them, her red eyes burning. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the window. But this time, Mike was ready. He chanted the last words of the ritual, and a surge of energy exploded through him. The woman screamed, her form disintegrating into mist as the talisman pulsed with power. Silence. The desert was still once more. Mike and Dave sat there stunned as the sun began to rise in the distance. The nightmare was over. But Mike knew that some things, some places, were never truly at peace. They had freed the spirit, but the desert held its secrets, and some roads were meant to be avoided. They never spoke of that night again. The haunted highway became a legend, a story passed down among truckers. But Mike, like many others, never set foot on that road again. And as time went on, the terror of the ghostly woman faded into memory. Until one day, another driver told his story. The desert was still there, and so too was the spirit.